My name is Natalie. My 6-year-old daughter found a brass key beneath the passenger seat of my husband's car. She held it up and asked, "Mommy, is this for Daddy's other home?" I laughed because I thought she was playing. Then she told me she had already been there. I was 31 when this happened, and for a long time I believed the worst part was the possibility that my husband was having an affair. I was wrong. The worst part was discovering how many people had quietly agreed that my pain was an acceptable price for keeping their lives comfortable. Before I tell you how the truth finally came out, subscribe to Unheard drama stories. Here, the people who were ignored get to finish their own sentences, and the truth is allowed to arrive without shouting. CLAIRE from accounting. Evan and I had been married for 8 years. We had a daughter, Lily, a modest house outside Raleigh, and the kind of life that looked stable because every problem had a calendar reminder. I managed a physical therapy clinic. Evan worked in operations for a furniture distributor. He was charming, practical, and good at making tensions seem unreasonable. Claire joined his company 2 years earlier. At first she was simply Claire from accounting. Then she became Claire, who saved the quarterly report, and later Claire, who understands how insane work is. She texted after dinner. She sent memes on Sundays. At the company picnic, she called Evan her work husband and laughed while watching my face. When I said the phrase bothered me, Evan accused me of being insecure. He showed me their messages, but only after disappearing into the bathroom with his phone for 10 minutes. Everything left on the screen was professional enough to make me feel foolish. So I apologized for asking. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying every small moment I had dismissed, the changed subject, the nervous glance, the joke that landed too close to the truth. Separately, each detail had seemed harmless. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer look away from. In the days surrounding that discovery, I began noticing details I had previously dismissed. Each time I tried to describe the problem, someone reduced it to a personality conflict. Facts were treated as anger, while the behavior that created them was treated as family business. The part I had once described as the possibility that my husband was having an affair was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. Nothing about the process felt powerful at first. It felt administrative, lonely, and slow. Only later did I recognize that consistency was becoming a form of strength. I could not control what anyone admitted. I could control whether confusion continued to make decisions for me. The other home. The key appeared on a Saturday morning after Evan took my car to buy groceries and left his in the driveway. Lily climbed into the passenger seat to retrieve a coloring book. When she asked about Daddy's other home, my chest tightened. She explained that 2 weeks earlier Evan had picked her up from school because I was working late. He drove to a building with orange doors where Claire was waiting. They carried boxes inside. Lily sat on a folded blanket and ate crackers while the adults argued about where a sofa would go. Evan had told her it was a work storage place and asked her not to mention it because the furniture was a surprise for me. I asked what kind of furniture she saw. "A blue couch," she said, "and a bed with a yellow blanket. Claire said the little room could be mine sometimes." I kept my expression calm until Lily ran outside. Then I locked myself in the laundry room and pressed both hands against the dryer to stop them shaking. There is a particular kind of loneliness in realizing that the people who know your softest places have been using that knowledge as a map. I did not feel angry first. I felt embarrassed. Then I remembered that trust is not stupidity. The shame belonged to the person who exploited it, not the person who offered it honestly. The practical consequences arrived before my emotions had caught up. I thought about the younger version of me who had learned that being loved meant being easy to manage. She would have apologized simply for making the room uncomfortable. The part I had once described as the possibility that my husband was having an affair was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. There was financial and practical damage, but there was also a quieter loss, the realization that someone had planned around my expected silence. For the first time, I gave my own memory the same credibility I had always given everyone else's explanation. Unit 218. The key had a plastic tag stamped 218. I photographed it and returned it exactly where Lily found it. That afternoon, I searched storage facilities near Evan's office until I found one with orange doors. I did not go inside. Instead, I drove past and saw his company truck parked near Unit 218. I called an attorney before confronting him. She told me that entering the unit could create legal complications if my name was not on the rental agreement. She advised me to focus on finances and safety. That advice saved me from turning a terrible discovery into an impulsive mistake. Our joint savings account had been shrinking in small amounts, $800, $1,200, $500. Evan had labeled them home repairs and business reimbursements. The repairs had never happened. The reimbursement deposits never arrived. A credit report showed a new card in his name with our home listed as the billing address. The balance was nearly $18,000. The storage unit was not the secret, it was the door handle. For the first time, I stopped asking what would keep the family calm and started asking what would keep me safe. That single change in the question altered everything. It moved me from reacting to planning, from pleading to documenting, and from hoping someone would rescue me to understanding that I was allowed to protect myself. The people around me focused on my reaction because examining the original decision was harder. The temptation to act dramatically was strong. A public confrontation might have brought temporary relief, but it could also have scattered the evidence and allowed everyone to debate tone instead of conduct. The part I had once described as the possibility that my husband was having an affair was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. The temptation to act dramatically was strong. A public confrontation might have brought temporary relief, but it could also have scattered the evidence and allowed everyone to debate tone instead of conduct. The truth was still painful, but it was no longer shapeless. The future they had furnished. I waited until Evan left for a supposed overnight inventory project. Then I checked the shared tablet he had forgotten to sign out of. His email was closed, but a furniture ordering app displayed recent deliveries. The blue couch, yellow blanket, dining set, and children's desk had all been delivered to a furnished apartment complex 10 minutes from the storage facility. The customer name was Claire Bennett. A message preview appeared before the app locked. After the conference, we tell them, no more delays. I did not need to read anything else. Later, Claire's husband, Marcus, would tell me the full plan. Evan and Claire had been moving money for months. They intended to announce that both marriages were over after an industry conference, then move into the apartment they had already furnished. Claire had told Evan that presenting a ready-made home would make Lily adjust faster. They had discussed my daughter as if she were a lamp that needed a different corner. I did not want revenge. Revenge would have kept me emotionally tied to them. What I wanted was a clean record of the truth, a boundary that could not be negotiated in private, and a future that did not depend on anyone suddenly developing a conscience. Once the facts were visible, the old family explanations stopped sounding harmless. I began to understand that the conflict was not only about the latest event. It was about a long arrangement in which other people made choices and expected me to absorb the consequences. The part I had once described as the possibility that my husband was having an affair was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. I also had to accept that people who benefited from the old arrangement might never call my new boundary fair. Their agreement was not a requirement for my protection. I did not feel fearless. I felt prepared, and preparation was enough to move forward. The calm week. For 7 days I behaved normally. I packed lunches, answered work emails, and listened while Evan described fake inventory problems. Quietly, I opened an individual bank account, redirected my salary, copied tax returns, froze my credit, changed the passwords on accounts that were solely mine, and documented every transfer from our joint savings. I also contacted Marcus. I did not send accusations. I sent one photograph of the order history and asked whether he recognized the address. He replied 20 minutes later, "That is not our address, please call me." Marcus had suspected something but had been convinced he was controlling. Claire used the same language Evan used with me, paranoid, insecure, dramatic. We compared only records we legally possessed. The overlap was devastating. Hotel charges appeared as client dinners. Cash withdrawals matched apartment deposits. Their work conference included a personal reservation for 2 additional nights. Neither of us confronted them yet. For once, the people being lied to controlled the timing. People often imagine courage as a loud thing. Mine was quiet. It looked like saving screenshots, making copies, calling a professional, and refusing to answer messages designed to pull me back into panic. I was still afraid. I simply stopped letting fear make my decisions. In the days surrounding that discovery, I began noticing details I had previously dismissed. The more calmly I responded, the more urgently others tried to provoke an emotional reaction. Anger would have allowed them to change the subject from what happened to how I behaved after learning it. The part I had once described as the possibility that my husband was having an affair was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. I noticed how often concern was expressed as pressure. Forgive quickly, decide privately, avoid embarrassment, and remember everything the other person had ever done for me. That clarity did not remove grief. It simply prevented grief from being used as a leash. The dinner conversation. The night before the conference, I asked Evan to sit at the dining table after Lily went to sleep. I placed the brass key between us. His face changed before he said a word. I told him I knew about Unit 218, the apartment, the credit card, and the missing savings. I did not tell him how much evidence I had. He began with denial, moved to anger, then reached for sympathy. He said Claire was leaving a difficult marriage. He said he had only helped her furnish a place. He said he planned to repay the money. Then I repeated Lily's sentence. Claire said the little room could be mine sometimes. Evan looked away. I told him my attorney had prepared temporary custody and financial orders and that he needed to leave for a hotel. He laughed and said I could not remove him from his own house. Then the doorbell rang. A process server stood on the porch. The timing was not dramatic by accident. It was the first decision in months that Evan had not made for me. The hardest part was accepting that an apology, even a sincere one, would not return the version of the relationship I thought I had. Some truths do not merely solve a mystery. They change the meaning of the years that came before them. The practical consequences arrived before my emotions had caught up. I also had to accept that people who benefited from the old arrangement might never call my new boundary fair. Their agreement was not a requirement for my protection. The part I had once described as the possibility that my husband was having an affair was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. I thought about the younger version of me who had learned that being loved meant being easy to manage. She would have apologized simply for making the room uncomfortable. Once I understood that, the next step became difficult but no longer impossible. When arrived. Claire came to my house the next morning. She wore sunglasses and carried herself like someone entering a negotiation. She said Evan had misled her, that she believed our marriage was already over, and that women should not attack each other over a man. I agreed with the last sentence. Then I told her I had not contacted her employer, posted online, or threatened her. I had contacted an attorney and her husband because money had been taken from 2 households. This was not a competition for Evan. It was an accounting of choices. She began crying and asked me not to destroy everyone's lives. I remember how strange that phrase sounded. The apartment was furnished. The conference was booked. My daughter had been taken there and coached to keep it secret. Their lives were not being destroyed by discovery. Their plan was simply losing the protection of my ignorance. I asked her to leave. She stood on the porch for several seconds, waiting for me to soften. I closed the door. By then, I understood something I had resisted for too long. Peace is not the absence of conflict. Sometimes peace begins when you finally allow the necessary conflict to happen in the open. The people around me focused on my reaction because examining the original decision was harder. Nothing about the process felt powerful at first. It felt administrative, lonely, and slow. Only later did I recognize that consistency was becoming a form of strength. The part I had once described as the possibility that my husband was having an affair was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. The more calmly I responded, the more urgently others tried to provoke an emotional reaction. Anger would have allowed them to change the subject from what happened to how I behaved after learning it. That was when I stopped measuring my choices by whether the family approved and started measuring them by whether I could live safely with the result. The life after the key. The divorce took 11 months. Financial records showed that Evan had used marital funds for the apartment and concealed debt. The court ordered reimbursement through the property settlement. Because he had involved Lily in the secrecy, the parenting plan required counseling and prohibited either parent from asking her to hide information from the other. Claire and Marcus divorced as well. Evan and Claire moved into the apartment briefly, but the relationship collapsed once it became ordinary life instead of a secret future. I learned that from mutual acquaintances, not from watching them. Lily asked why Daddy lived somewhere else. I told her adults sometimes make promises they cannot keep, but none of it was her fault. I never told her she had exposed him. A child should not carry the weight of saving a parent. I kept the brass key until the divorce was final. Then I placed it in a small box with copies of the first bank statements, not because I wanted to remember Evan, but because I wanted to remember the woman I became after I stopped letting him define what was reasonable. At the time, I kept trying to explain the situation in the kindest possible way. That was an old habit of mine, soften the truth until everyone else felt comfortable, even when I was the one being hurt. Looking back, that instinct was not kindness. It was fear dressed up as patience. What happened after? 2 years later, Evan is more consistent with Lily than I expected. Trust is limited, but the structure is clear. He once apologized and said he had convinced himself that preparing the apartment was kind because it would reduce disruption. I told him kindness does not require a child to keep secrets from her mother. I bought a smaller house with a bright kitchen and no hidden accounts. Lily chose purple curtains for her room. On the day we moved in, she asked whether this was our real home. I told her a real home is not the place with the nicest furniture. It is the place where nobody has to pretend not to know what they know. A boundary is not a punishment. It is information about what access to you requires. The lesson I kept. The key did not end my marriage. The choices behind it did. My questions were not paranoia, and my discomfort was not insecurity. Those labels were tools used to keep me from examining facts. I learned to trust evidence, but I also learned to trust the moment my body recognized a truth my mind was still trying to excuse. Some people will call your boundary cruel because your silence was convenient for them. Let them. A peaceful life built on truth may look smaller from the outside, but it feels infinitely larger when you are finally free inside it. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever been made to feel selfish for protecting yourself, remember this: love does not require you to disappear. Subscribe to Unheard Drama Stories for more stories where hidden truths finally have a voice.